The first light of June 6, 1944, revealed hell on earth. Along the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy, thousands of young men stormed through machine gun fire, mortar explosions, and razor wire into what would become the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The English Channel churned with landing craft, battleships, and the bodies of soldiers who would never reach the shore. Omaha Beach turned crimson as men fell by the hundreds in the first terrifying minutes. Utah Beach saw chaos and confusion as currents pushed landing craft off course. Gold, Juneau, and Sword beaches witnessed British and Canadian forces fighting their way inland against fortified German positions. The air filled with the deafening roar of artillery, the metallic clang of bullets striking steel, and the desperate shouts of officers rallying their men forward. This was D-Day, the moment when the fate of Western Europe hung in the balance, when every inch of sand was purchased with courage and blood. By nightfall, against all odds and at tremendous cost, the Allies had secured their foothold on French soil. Over 156,000 troops had landed across 5 beaches, establishing a beachhead that would become the launching point for the liberation of Europe. But as soldiers pushed inland through smoking villages and cratered fields, they encountered an enemy far more ancient and unyielding than the German Wehrmacht. The Norman countryside, with its patchwork of small farms and narrow lanes, was divided by a labyrinth of hedgerows that had stood for centuries, and these living walls would prove nearly as deadly as any German fortification. The tactical situation was growing desperate. Each field became a separate battle, each hedgerow a fortified position. German troops would hide in the thick vegetation, waiting until American tanks exposed their bellies, then fire and disappear into the next hedgerow before Allied infantry could respond. Even when tanks made it over a hedgerow intact, they found themselves trapped in small, enclosed fields with limited visibility and no room to maneuver. The German defenders, many of them, the solution came to him not in a flash of inspiration but through methodical reasoning. If climbing over the hedgerows was suicide, and going around them was impossible given their density, then the only option was to go through them. But to go through, a tank would need something to cut through the packed earth and tear apart the root systems. It would need teeth. It would need tusks. It would need to become something new, not just a tank, but a battering ram that could keep its armor facing forward while it plowed through obstacles. Culin began sketching. His first designs were crude, but the basic concept was sound. Attach steel prongs to the front of a Sherman tank, angled slightly downward so they would dig into the base of a hedgerow. The tank's weight and engine power would drive the prongs through the earthen bank, tearing roots and pushing soil aside. The tank would remain level, its frontal armor protecting the crew, its gun ready to fire the moment it broke through to the other side. The prongs would need to be strong enough to withstand the impact and rigid enough not to bend or break. They would need to be positioned correctly to distribute the force evenly across the tank's front hull. But having an idea and building it were two different things. Culin needed steel, and not just any steel. He needed heavy structural steel that could take punishment. He needed welding equipment. He needed a damaged tank that he could use for testing without taking a combat-ready vehicle out of service. And perhaps most importantly, he needed permission, or at least the willingness of his superiors to look the other way while he experimented with modifying army property. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source: the very obstacles the Germans had placed on the beaches to stop the Allied landing. The French coast had been fortified with thousands of steel anti-tank obstacles, X-shaped welded beams called check hedgehogs that were designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft and block the advance of vehicles. Now that the beaches were secure, these obstacles lay scattered across the sand, no longer serving their original purpose but made of exactly the kind of heavy steel Culin needed. He requisitioned a truck, drove to the nearest beach, and loaded up as many hedgehogs as he could fit. Back at the squadron's position, Culin enlisted the help of other mechanically minded soldiers. Together, they cut the hedgehogs apart using acetylene torches, creating individual steel beams about 6 feet long. They sharpened the ends into points using grinding wheels. They calculated angles and measured distances on a damaged Sherman that had been pulled from a hedgerow engagement after taking minor damage. The tank's engine still ran, its track still moved, but it had been classified as non-combat ready, making it perfect for Culin's purposes. The welding process took days. Working in the French summer heat, stopping whenever German artillery came too close, Culin and his team attached 4 heavy steel prongs to the front of the Sherman's hull. They positioned them at a slight downward angle, about 18 inches off the ground, spaced evenly across the width of the tank. Each prong was welded in multiple places, creating a framework that was both rigid and strong. They reinforced the welds, ground them smooth, and added cross-bracing to prevent the prongs from twisting under lateral stress. The finished product looked brutal and purposeful, a Sherman tank that had grown tusks. Other soldiers gathered to watch as the work progressed, offering suggestions, making jokes, placing bets on whether it would work. Some called it Culin's folly. Others thought it might actually solve the problem. Officers stopped by, asked questions, examined the welds, and generally seemed willing to let Culin continue as long as he didn't interfere with regular operations. There was a sense among the men that anything was worth trying at this point. Within hours, word of the successful test had reached General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army. Bradley immediately recognized the significance of Culin's invention and ordered it to be implemented across all available Sherman tanks as quickly as possible. The Army's ordnance units were mobilized to begin mass production of the Hedgerow cutters. But there wasn't time to wait for factory-made versions. Bradley wanted every tank equipped before the upcoming Operation Cobra, the planned breakout offensive from Normandy. The solution was pure American ingenuity. Bradley ordered that every tank unit should fabricate their own Hedgerow cutters using whatever steel they could find. The French beaches still had thousands of German obstacles that could be cut up and welded onto tanks. Ordnance companies set up impromptu fabrication yards, working around the clock with cutting torches and welding equipment. Tank crews themselves got involved, learning basic welding techniques and modifying their own vehicles. Within 2 weeks, hundreds of Sherman tanks had been converted into Rhinoceroses. But the work didn't stop with simply copying Culin's original design. Soldiers in different units began experimenting with variations, each trying to optimize the device for their specific needs. Some crews added serrated edges to the prongs, reasoning that teeth would cut through roots more efficiently than smooth steel. Others adjusted the angle of the prongs, finding that a slightly sharper downward angle allowed tanks to dig deeper into the earthen banks. A few innovative crews added horizontal bars behind the vertical prongs, creating a cage-like structure that could push aside debris as the tank plowed through. Tankers in the 3rd Armored Division discovered that the prongs could serve a secondary purpose, clearing German anti-tank mines. By lowering the prongs slightly and driving slowly, tanks could detonate mines at a safe distance from the hull, using the steel beams as a kind of mechanical minesweeper. This required reinforcing the welds even further, but the added weight was worth the protection it provided. The 4th Armored Division experimented with asymmetric designs, with longer prongs on one side than the other. This allowed tanks to create an angled breach through hedgerows, which proved useful when trying to flank German positions. The asymmetric prongs would tear a diagonal gap, allowing following tanks and infantry to enter the next field from an unexpected direction, catching defenders by surprise. As more and more Rhinoceros tanks rolled off the improvised assembly lines, Allied tactics began to change. Tank commanders who had spent weeks carefully probing for weaknesses in the Hedgerow defenses could now simply punch through wherever they chose. The psychological impact on German defenders was immediate and devastating. Positions that had seemed impregnable, machine gun nests hidden behind hedgerows, anti-tank guns positioned to fire at climbing tanks, suddenly became vulnerable as Shermans crashed through the vegetation with their guns blazing. The first major combat test of the massed Rhinoceros tanks came on July 25, 1944, with the launch of Operation Cobra. After weeks of grinding positional warfare, Bradley had concentrated over 1,500 tanks for a massive breakout offensive near St. Lo. Many of these tanks now bore Culin's steel prongs. The operation began with a devastating carpet bombing by hundreds of Allied bombers, followed immediately by a massive armored assault. This time, when the Shermans reached the hedgerows, they didn't slow down. Tank after tank smashed through the ancient barriers, tearing gaps wide enough for entire columns to follow. The Germans, who had prepared defensive positions based on the assumption that hedgerows would channel and slow the American advance, found themselves outflanked and overrun before they could reposition. Rhinoceros tanks burst into fields where German infantry had dug in, surprising defenders who had no time to bring their weapons to bear. Anti-tank guns, carefully positioned to cover the approaches over Hedgerows, found themselves firing at the frontal armor of charging Shermans instead of their vulnerable bellies. The breakout that had seemed impossible just weeks before now became a reality. American armored divisions poured through the gaps torn by the Rhinoceros tanks, fanning out across the French countryside. The 2nd Armored Division advanced over 10 miles in a single day, a rate of progress that had been unthinkable during the weeks of Hedgerow fighting. The 3rd Armored Division encircled entire German units that couldn't retreat fast enough through the bocage. What had been a static, grinding stalemate transformed into mobile warfare that played to American strengths in logistics, air support, and armored mobility. German commanders were caught completely off guard. Intelligence reports reaching German headquarters described American tanks equipped with mysterious devices that allowed them to break through hedgerows without exposing vulnerable armor. Some reports called them devil tanks, or tusked monsters. Attempts to adapt defensive tactics came too late. The Germans tried positioning anti-tank weapons to cover the fronts of hedgerows rather than the tops, but the speed and number of rhinoceros breaches made it impossible to defend every potential crossing point. They tried reinforcing hedgerows with additional obstacles, but the steel prongs simply pushed through or around these obstacles. They even tried creating false hedgerows that would collapse under a tank's weight, but Allied reconnaissance quickly identified these traps. For Curtis Culin, who had started all of this with a sketch in a notebook and some salvaged steel, the rapid proliferation of his invention was both gratifying and overwhelming. He had been promoted to technical sergeant and awarded the Legion of Merit for his innovation, one of the fastest battlefield promotions and decorations of the war. Officers from other divisions visited to consult with him, asking for advice on modifications and improvements. Reporters wanted to interview him for Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper. There was even talk of a medal ceremony with General Bradley himself. But Culin remained remarkably modest about his achievement. When fellow soldiers congratulated him, he would shrug and say something like, "Just did what needed doing," or, "Any mechanic could have thought of it." He seemed more interested in continued improvements to the design than in taking credit for the original invention. He spent his time visiting different tank units, examining their variations on the Hedgerow cutter, offering suggestions, and learning from the innovations others had made. There was a collaborative spirit to the whole process that Culin seemed to appreciate, an idea that had grown beyond its creator to become something owned by every soldier who welded a set of prongs onto his tank. Yet the human cost of the war never escaped Culin's thoughts. Even as his invention saved lives by allowing tanks to maintain their armor protection, men still died in the breakout from Normandy. The Hedgerow cutters solved one problem, but combat remained deadly. German resistance, though disrupted, remained fierce. Snipers still found targets. Artillery still rained down. Infantry still had to clear buildings and bunkers. And even the Rhinoceros tanks, for all their advantages, could still be destroyed by a well-placed shot from a Panther or Tiger tank, or by a determined German soldier with a Panzerfaust. Culin witnessed this firsthand on several occasions. During one engagement in late July, he watched a Sherman equipped with his Hedgerow cutter burst through a bocage barrier only to be struck in the side by a German tank that had been hidden in a tree line. The Sherman exploded, killing its entire crew instantly. These were men Culin knew, men who had joked with him about the mad mechanic and his crazy ideas. Now they were gone, and no amount of welded steel could have saved them from that particular shot at that particular moment. The moral weight of invention in wartime pressed on him. He had created a tool that undoubtedly saved American lives, but it was a tool whose purpose was to make killing more efficient. The Hedgerow cutters allowed American tanks to destroy German positions more effectively, which meant more German soldiers died. Young men, many of them conscripts who had no choice about fighting, were being killed by weapons that moved faster and struck harder because of something Culin had designed. He understood the necessity. The Nazis had to be defeated, the war had to be won, but understanding didn't make the reality any easier to carry. These thoughts occupied his mind during the rare quiet moments, when the guns fell silent and the immediate urgency of survival gave way to reflection. Fellow soldiers sometimes found him sitting alone, smoking a cigarette, staring at nothing in particular. They learned not to disturb him during these moments, recognizing them as the price every soldier paid for truly seeing what war demanded. As August turned to September and Allied forces continued their advance across France, the Hedgerow cutters became standard equipment on American tanks. The initial improvisations gave way to more refined designs produced by ordnance depots and even by factories back in the United States. Engineers studied Culin's original concept and created optimized versions with improved steel, better welding techniques, and more sophisticated mounting systems. The basic principle remained the same: steel prongs attached to the front hull of a tank, angled to tear through earthen barriers, but the execution became more professional and standardized. The device saw continued use beyond Normandy as well. When American forces encountered similar obstacles in the Siegfried Line along the German border, the Hedgerow cutters proved effective at clearing tank traps and earthen fortifications. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when German forces launched their surprise counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, American tank crews used modified cutters to push through roadblocks and fallen trees. The adaptability of the basic concept, using welded steel prongs to clear obstacles, demonstrated its fundamental soundness. Other Allied nations took note as well. British tank crews began fabricating their own versions of the Hedgerow cutter, adapting it to their Churchill and Cromwell tanks. Canadian armored units experimented with variations designed for the specific terrain they encountered in the Netherlands. Even some Soviet tank crews, upon hearing about the American innovation through intelligence channels, created similar devices for their T-34 tanks when facing defensive obstacles in Eastern Europe. The invention also influenced post-war tank design. Military engineers studying the Normandy campaign recognized that future tanks would need to be equipped with some means of clearing obstacles as a standard feature rather than as a battlefield improvisation. This thinking led to the development of mine plows, dozer blades, and other specialized equipment that became integral parts of armored warfare doctrine. The principle that Culin had demonstrated, that a relatively simple modification could dramatically enhance a tank's capabilities, became a guiding concept for armor development. For his contributions, Culin received additional recognition as the war continued. He was awarded the Bronze Star for his continued technical innovations and leadership. His promotion to warrant officer came through in early 1945, officially recognizing his expertise and value to the Army. When victory in Europe was declared in May 1945, Culin found himself part of the occupation forces in Germany, working with ordnance units to assess captured German equipment and share technical knowledge with other Allied nations. Throughout all of this, Culin maintained his characteristic humility. When interviewed by military historians documenting the war's technical innovations, he consistently deflected credit, emphasizing the collaborative nature of the work and the contributions of countless soldiers who had improved upon his initial design. He spoke more about the men who had died in the Hedgerows than about his own achievement, and he insisted that any mechanic with similar training and observation might have come up with the same solution. After the war, Curtis Culin returned to Cranford, New Jersey, and resumed civilian life with the same quiet determination he had shown in uniform. He went back to working as a mechanic, operating a small garage where he fixed cars, trucks, and farm equipment. Neighbors and customers who knew of his wartime service would occasionally ask him about the Hedgerow cutters, and he would answer their questions politely but briefly before steering the conversation back to carburetors or transmissions. He married, raised a family, and lived the kind of ordinary, productive life that millions of returning veterans sought after the extraordinary circumstances of global war. The garage where Culin worked bore no plaques commemorating his invention, no photographs of generals awarding him medals, no newspaper clippings framed on the walls. Inside, amid the smell of motor oil and welding fumes, he continued to solve mechanical problems with the same practical ingenuity he had applied to the Hedgerows of Normandy. When a farmer brought in a broken combine harvester, Culin would study it, sketch possible solutions, and fabricate replacement parts from whatever materials were at hand. When a truck needed a custom mounting bracket, he would measure, cut, and weld with the precision and confidence born from years of experience. The skills that had saved lives in France now served a peaceful purpose, keeping the machinery of daily life running smoothly. Yet the impact of what Culin had created in those desperate weeks after D-Day continued to reverberate through military history. The Hedgerow cutter became a case study taught at military academies and war colleges around the world. It appeared in countless books about World War II, in documentaries about armored warfare, and in strategic analyses of the Normandy campaign. Military theorists used it as an example of how necessity drives innovation, how soldiers at the tactical level can solve problems that perplex high-level planners, and how simple mechanical solutions can have strategic consequences. The story became particularly significant during later conflicts when American forces again found themselves fighting in terrain that favored defenders. During the Vietnam War, when tanks and armored personnel carriers struggled with jungle vegetation and rice paddy dikes, engineers looked back at Culin's solution for inspiration. Some units fabricated modified plow blades and cutting bars for their vehicles, applying the same principle of using steel attachments to clear obstacles. The lesson had been learned. When standard equipment proves inadequate, improvisation and soldier initiative can bridge the gap. In Iraq and Afghanistan, decades after World Culin's death in 1963, American service members again found themselves adapting equipment to meet unexpected challenges. When improvised explosive devices buried in roads became a deadly threat, soldiers welded protective armor to vehicles, creating up-armored Humvees in much the same improvised fashion that Culin had created his Hedgerow cutters. When mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles needed modifications for urban warfare, mechanics and soldiers worked together to add equipment and change configurations based on battlefield experience. The spirit of practical innovation that Culin exemplified remained alive in the American military's culture. The broader lesson of Curtis Culin's achievement extends beyond military applications. His story embodies the power of direct observation, critical thinking, and the willingness to challenge conventional approaches when they prove inadequate. Culin didn't wait for someone else to solve the Hedgerow problem. He didn't defer to higher authority or assume that if a solution existed, it would come from engineers at headquarters or designers back in the United States. Instead, he looked at the problem, applied his knowledge and skills, and built something that worked. Then he shared it freely, allowing others to improve upon his design and adapt it to their needs. This pattern of identifying problems, creating solutions, and collaborating on improvements represents a fundamentally democratic approach to innovation. Culin wasn't a general or an engineer with an advanced degree. He was a sergeant and a mechanic who paid attention, thought creatively, and acted decisively. The fact that his improvised invention became standard equipment for thousands of tanks demonstrates that good ideas can come from anywhere, and that organizations that listen to their frontline personnel gain enormous advantages. The Hedgerow cutter also illustrates how small changes can have disproportionate effects. The modification Culin designed didn't require exotic materials or revolutionary technology. It was just steel beams welded to a tank in a specific configuration. Yet this simple change transformed the tactical situation in Normandy, enabling the breakout that led to the liberation of France and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. The tank's engine, armor, and weapons remained the same. Only the addition of steel prongs changed, but those prongs changed everything about how the tank could be employed in the bocage terrain. This principle, that minor modifications to existing systems can yield major improvements, has applications far beyond warfare. In business, technology, medicine, and countless other fields, incremental innovations often prove more valuable than attempts at complete redesign. Culin didn't try to invent a new kind of tank. He simply added a feature that allowed existing tanks to overcome a specific obstacle. Sometimes the best solution is not to start from scratch, but to modify what you already have in clever ways. The human element of Culin's story also deserves recognition. He could have kept his idea to himself, avoiding the risk and work of building a prototype. He could have grown discouraged when others were skeptical. He could have demanded credit and recognition before sharing the design with other units. Instead, he persevered through the difficult process of turning an idea into reality, accepted help from others, and freely shared the results so that as many soldiers as possible could benefit. This generosity of spirit, this willingness to contribute to a collective effort without demanding individual glory, represents the best qualities of citizen soldiers who served in World War II. Culin's modesty about his achievement, both during the war and afterward, also speaks to his character. He understood that while his invention was significant, it was just one small piece of a massive military effort involving millions of people. He recognized that his moment of insight built upon the work of countless engineers who had designed the Sherman tank, the soldiers who had fought and died to establish the beachhead in Normandy, and the mechanics who had trained him in his craft. He saw himself as part of a larger story rather than as its central hero, and this perspective kept him grounded even as others celebrated his contribution. The emotional complexity of being an inventor whose creation saves some lives while facilitating the taking of others is something Culin carried throughout his life. Those who knew him well said that he never gloried in the military applications of his work, even though he understood its necessity. He spoke more readily about using his mechanical skills to help people in peacetime than about his wartime service. This suggests a mature understanding that while his invention was justified by the circumstances of fighting Nazi Germany, war itself remained a tragedy even when necessary. As the years passed and World War II receded into history, Curtis Culin's name became less widely known outside of military circles, but his invention remained famous. The image of a Sherman tank with steel prongs welded to its front became an iconic symbol of American ingenuity and adaptability in combat. Museums displayed Rhinoceros tanks. Reenactors at historical events would demonstrate how the Hedgerow cutters worked. Veterans who had served in armored units would tell stories about the tusked Shermans that had saved their lives in the bocage. The survival rate for tank crews improved dramatically once the Hedgerow cutters were widely deployed. Before Culin's invention, crews climbing over hedgerows faced roughly a 1 in 4 chance of being knocked out on any given crossing. After the cutters were installed, that rate dropped to less than 1 in 20 for similar engagements. While other factors also contributed to improved survival rates, better tactics, increased air support, declining German capabilities, the Hedgerow cutters' impact was undeniable. Hundreds of tank crews who might have died in the summer of 1944 instead survived to continue fighting, to witness the end of the war, and to return home to their families. These saved lives represent the true measure of Culin's contribution. Each tanker who survived because his Sherman could punch through a hedgerow instead of climbing over it was someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father. Each of these men went on to live full lives, to raise children, to work, to contribute to their communities. Their descendants, grandchildren and great-grandchildren who exist because an ancestor's tank had steel prongs welded to its nose, number in the thousands. This ripple effect, this cascade of life that flows from a single act of creative problem-solving, represents innovation's most profound impact. The story of Curtis Culin and the Hedgerow cutters reminds us that ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances can achieve remarkable things. Culin wasn't born a hero. He wasn't identified early in life as someone destined for historical significance. He was simply a competent mechanic who found himself in a situation where his skills were desperately needed, and who had the courage and creativity to act. This ordinariness makes his achievement more rather than less impressive, because it suggests that similar potential exists in countless people waiting for circumstances to call it forth. In the final analysis, the Hedgerow cutter stands as a testament to human adaptability and ingenuity. When Allied planners designed the invasion of Normandy, they anticipated the challenges of the beaches, the fortifications, the German defenders, but they didn't fully appreciate the obstacle that ancient French farming practices would create. This failure of imagination could have been catastrophic. The bocage might have bottled up Allied forces in Normandy for months, giving Germany time to shift resources, develop new weapons, and potentially avoid defeat. Instead, a sergeant with a welder found a solution that unlocked the stalemate and kept the momentum of liberation moving forward. The lesson resonates across generations. When faced with seemingly insurmountable obstacles, direct observation, practical thinking, and the willingness to try unconventional solutions can prevail. Curtis Culin didn't defeat Nazi Germany single-handedly, but his invention played a crucial role at a critical moment. He saw a problem that others had accepted as unsolvable, refused to accept that acceptance, and built something that worked. In doing so, he embodied the spirit that won World War II, not just industrial might or military leadership, but the creativity and determination of millions of individuals who refused to give up in the face of overwhelming challenges. Today, Visitors to military museums can see preserved examples of Sherman tanks with Hedgerow cutters still attached. The steel prongs, now rusty and weathered, still jut forward at that specific angle Culin calculated in the summer of 1944. These artifacts connect us directly to that moment of innovation, to the desperate weeks after D-Day when the liberation of Europe hung in the balance. They remind us that history is shaped not just by presidents and generals, but by sergeants and mechanics who see what needs to be done and find a way to do it. Curtis G. Culin III died in 1963, having lived to see his invention recognized in military histories and commemorated in museums. He passed away in the same community where he had grown up, surrounded by family and friends who knew him not as the inventor of the Hedgerow cutter but as a good neighbor, a skilled craftsman, and a decent man. His funeral was attended by fellow veterans who understood the significance of his contribution, by customers whose cars and trucks he had kept running for decades, and by family members who knew him as a husband, father, and grandfather first and as a war hero second. In his modest way, Culin had shown what one person with practical skills and clear observation could accomplish. He had demonstrated that innovation doesn't require genius, just attention, persistence, and the courage to try something new when old methods fail. He had proven that sharing credit and collaborating with others amplifies impact rather than diminishing it. And he had lived his values, treating his wartime achievement as neither a burden nor a trophy but simply as something that had needed doing, which he had done. The Norman hedgerows still stand in France, marking field boundaries as they have for centuries. Tank enthusiasts and historians still visit the battlefields where the bocage turned farmland into fortresses. And when they imagine the desperate summer of 1944, when Allied forces struggled to break free from the Normandy beachhead, they picture Curtis Culin with a welder's torch, cutting up German obstacles on a beach and transforming them into tools of liberation. They see him sketching in his notebook, calculating angles, testing welds. They see the first Rhinoceros tank tearing through an ancient hedgerow, prongs of steel carrying the hopes of thousands of soldiers forward into battle. This image endures because it represents something fundamental about human nature. Our capacity to adapt, to create, to overcome obstacles through ingenuity and effort. Curtis Culin's Hedgerow cutter remains more than a piece of military hardware. It stands as a monument to the idea that challenges can be met, that problems can be solved, and that ordinary people, when circumstances demand it, can accomplish extraordinary things. In a war full of suffering, tragedy, and heroism, one mechanic from New Jersey found a way to save lives and change history using nothing but observation, knowledge, welded steel, and an unwillingness to accept failure. That story, like the man himself, deserves to be remembered.